Nice and close. So yeah, my name is David Bravo. I work as a security consultant at Bishop Fox, and I predominantly hack web apps and cloud environments. I also work on the retained security consulting part of the practice, where I do a lot of work to strategize and create systems to efficiently test large swaths of applications. So yeah, I went to NYU, went to the engineering school there, so if there's any NYU folks out here, hopefully you guys are enjoying the weather. It is much better here than in New York. And I am an Arsenal fan, so Arsenal is a British Premier League team that's like the top tier of British football or soccer. They're recently good. For many years they were not, so it's really, really great to be a fan of Arsenal recently. So yeah, that's a bit about me. Let's talk about AWS Cognito. So AWS Cognito is a service that AWS provides, and it abstracts a lot of functionality related to authentication, authorization, and user management for web and mobile apps. You can, the client or the front end can be basically anything, but it abstracts a lot of that information. You have two main concepts. There are user pools and identity pools. The user pools are mostly in charge of managing the lists of users, providing functionality for signing up, authenticating, and authorizing. And then the identity pool is in charge of functionality that will actually map roles in AWS to the users in user pools. So in the end, both of these combine to basically provide a functionality where you can have authentication, authorization, and provide access to AWS resources through this service. A lot of, and what I've seen it in practice is often engineers will use this to implement some of this functionality for their application that's already hosted in AWS. So let's say you have a web app or some sort of mobile application with a bunch of server-side functionality. You'll have that in AWS, and then you can leverage AWS Cognito to abstract and sort of like not need to implement and maintain lots of functionality related to authentication, authorization, etc. So yeah, now we're experts in AWS Cognito. Let's take a look at this picture here. So yeah, this is an interesting scenario. I didn't talk about it, but briefly, what's going on here is that an application is authenticating to the user pool, which, remember, that's sort of like the list of users, and then authentication is happening through a federated way to single sign-on or OIDC or SAML, any way that your company might implement single sign-on. And then you can actually, once you've authenticated that, interact with the identity pool to get tokens or AWS credentials to actually access resources in AWS. So for example, let's say you have functionality in your web application that needs to get data from an S3 bucket or put data in S3 bucket. You can actually provide that authentication and authorization through these components in AWS Cognito. All right, so potential misconfigurations. I say potential here because these configurations don't necessarily mean that it's actually a vulnerability. Everything is dependent on the context of the application, the context of what the application is intended to do, and the impact that you can eventually demonstrate. I work on the offensive side, so a lot of my thinking is always, all right, how can this configuration or these sets of this implementation lead to some demonstrable impact in the application? So let's talk about the first one, self-registration. You could think of this as like a self-sign-up, or let's say you're signing up a new user on your application. If your application is supposed to allow people to come and sign up, then yeah, that's fine. That's not a big deal. But let's say you are using AWS Cognito to present or protect an administrative panel. And if you have self-registration enabled, then in that scenario, anyone who visits the administration panel could go sign up and access the administration panel, and that might be a vulnerability for that particular context. Then modifiable user attributes. So in this case, you can think of this as key value pairs that may have some significance in your application. Where I've seen this used with an impact is usually where the key is maybe a role, for example, and then the value might be a user role or admin role. And then the application will actually use that value to determine what the user has access to. And now if you allow this to be modifiable, then a user can log in or register and then change their role to admin, and potentially you have a privilege escalation scenario there. And then finally, you have the exposure of a client secret. So this client secret, sometimes it will be super secret sauce, oftentimes probably not, but basically it's a little bit outside of the scope of the presentation as to where and how this value is generated and how it's used. But at a high level, how you can think of this secret is that it is a credential or a secret value that's necessary to interact with different services that are associated with AWS Cognito. So for example, AWS also sells a service that's kind of like an elk stack. So you have Kibana, Logstash, I think Elasticache, all kind of like in one thing, and you could link it to AWS Cognito so that you can actually protect or have that sort of login authentication with the elk stack. And so that elk stack or that application has a client secret, and that client secret is necessary for whenever AWS Cognito is interacting with it. Now, if this is exposed in a front-end asset, then suddenly maybe an unintended user or someone who is just accessing or browsing the application could leverage this and in unintended ways interact with the application, the elk stack in that scenario. All right. So let's talk about exploiting it. So actually, like, what you would type in the command line, what values you would be looking for, thinking about how this actually goes down in practice. So let's say you are assessing an application, you have burp up, you have your proxy, and you see some traffic going to a domain that looks something like amazoncognito.com. You'll see in that traffic a value that will probably be something like client ID or client underscore ID, all caps client ID. And this client ID is an ID associated with the user pool. And so let's say that user pool has self-registration enabled. You can actually, just without any authentication, go and use that client ID and provide a username and a password. And sometimes you'll need other attributes as well, like an email or maybe something else, a role, for example. And then you go in and you register your user, and now you've signed up. An interesting thing here is that when you sign up, you actually have to confirm the user. So that's why that email part or like maybe a phone number will be part of the attributes that you provide when you're signing up. And so then you sign up, you confirm the user, and then finally you can log in. And then when you log in, you can retrieve a token. Yes, you basically just retrieve a token, and that's your authentication token to the application. So now, once you have that authentication token, you're authenticated to the user pool, but to get some sort of impact or to do something with the application, you may be able to interact with it and that was unexpected. But ideally, what I'm thinking when I'm doing this is like, how can I get a foothold in the AWS environment now from this token and actually go play around with with the resources in there, hopefully get to some privilege escalation or some type of sensitive information. So I'll talk about what identity pools are in a moment as well and some configurations. At a high level, remember, identity pools are that component of AWS Cognito that will map permissions in the AWS environment to users who are authenticated to the user pools. Basically lets users interact with stuff in AWS. So we have our token, we've logged in. Now we can actually interact with the identity pool to retrieve AWS credentials for an authenticated user. A prerequisite for this is the identity pool ID. Similarly to what I was talking about with the client ID, where you'll see it in traffic, an identity pool ID is also something that you'll probably see in traffic. Look for identity pool ID, identity ID. These sorts of values are necessary to interact with the service, so you'll probably see it. And then you could type in something like this. Always refer to the docs as well. I think they even like a year ago or 2 years ago, they changed some of the names of AWS Cognito, so definitely refer to the docs, but the concept should be the same. You use that token and the identity ID to get AWS credentials, and then now you have a foothold in the AWS environment. Cool. Exploiting modifiable user attributes. So remember that concept before that I was talking about where you can have custom attributes for users in that user pool. You could think of it as like a role or anything. But let's use the example of a role. If I create a user and my role is user, but then the user pool allows me to modify the value of that role, then you have a scenario where you can escalate, you may be able to escalate privileges and do some unintended actions in the application. And so, as you see here, this is sort of an example command that you could write. And what this will do is modify your user attributes. When you re-authenticate or as you authenticate to the application, you will then be, you could be an admin then. This is, of course, with a bunch of assumptions, but that's the general idea of how you can exploit something like this. The exposure of the client secret. So this is that client secret that I was talking about that has to do with the application that would integrate with AWS Cognito. And that client secret is usually generated and sort of associated and necessary whenever you want to interact with that application. This is sometimes found in the front-end asset, and let's say and it is a credential. So when this is exposed, you can basically include this in some of the examples that I just showed you before, where you're exploiting self-sign-up or you're exploiting the modifiable user attributes, and you're actually interacting with the AWS service, AWS Cognito service, in unintended ways, getting access to it, and then maybe you can demonstrate some significant impact there. All right, so misconfigurations and identity pools. So that was the user pools. You could think of it almost kind of like as a user table, the authentication, the authorization to the user table. Now, the identity pools is focused on letting the users in the user pool access resources in an AWS account. A critical component of this is, of course, the IAM roles that you're using and the policies that you're describing. And again, I say potential because in some of these examples, they are not necessarily security vulnerabilities if they're configured in this way. Everything depends on the impact. Everything, rather on the context. Everything depends on what the application should be doing. So this first one is a relatively straightforward one, unauthenticated access. Basically, you can say, if you have the ID or sort of like my name, you can interact with me and I will give you access to the AWS account with the role that was assigned to an unauthenticated user. Depending on what policies are assigned to that unauthenticated user, there could be varying amounts of impact, but that's one example. So next, overly permissive IAM roles. This is a pretty critical part whenever you're assessing or trying to hack into AWS environments. And basically what you're looking for here as an attacker or maybe security engineer, hopefully also as an engineer, is looking where have these policies been implemented where they're very overly permissive. So assessing this is totally related to the identity pools as well. Then you have the exposure of the identity ID. This is not necessarily a big deal, I'd say, but it is something that when I'm assessing AWS Cognito or I'm mentoring someone who's assessing AWS Cognito and they find it, I'm telling them, okay, look for this value. See how you can escalate, see how you can access it, and hopefully you can demonstrate some impact there. So if possible, it would be nice to abstract it into the back end, but it's not necessary. It's not necessary. All right, exploiting the unauthenticated access. This one is relatively simple. As I said, you'll usually be interacting with a web application, or maybe you have source code, and you find something that looks like an identity pool ID or identity ID. These are not interchangeable, but as at a high level, you can think of it as an ID that is associated with the identity pool. And once you find it, if unauthenticated access is enabled, you can actually use that value to retrieve AWS credentials for the unauthenticated role, and then depending on what policies are associated to that role, you can do things in the AWS account. Hopefully you have some overly permissive policies assigned and you can demonstrate some impact. Or if you're an engineer, hopefully you don't have overly permissive policies assigned there. And yeah, so this is something I actually saw in the real world. This was a situation where it wasn't necessarily an unauthenticated user having these sets of permissions, but it was rather an authenticated user. So just a user who logs in regularly to the application had a ridiculous amount of permissions in the AWS account. And from here, we actually escalated privileges to own the AWS account. And so one of the core parts of that vulnerability or that chain of attacks was this overly permissive role in the AWS Cognito, associated with the role in that AWS Cognito implementation. So assessing the IAM roles is always critical in any AWS penetration test, but also like security assessment. And then for Cognito, you still have to be really, really careful as to what you're assigning your authenticated users. And lastly, the exposure of the identity pool ID. Again, I don't think this is a huge deal or necessarily a security vulnerability, but if you can, it would be nice for an attacker to not see it unless absolutely necessary. And so you can put it abstracted in the back end somewhere and not necessarily expose it to the front end assets or the users there. All right, that was that. So preventing issues in Cognito. Again, I usually work on the offensive side. So this is something that I would recommend to the engineers. And kind of like how I think of this checklist is, if it's not necessary, just remove it or disable it. But it always depends on the context of the application. So let's say you have an application that doesn't need users to sign up new users. It doesn't need external people to create new users. Disable self-registration, or I think in that case it's don't enable it. For attributes that you assign to users and user pools, make sure you make the attributes immutable if you don't want them to be mutable. Also, conducting an analysis as to what assumptions your application is making of those attributes is useful, because let's say one engineering team decides, yes, they should be mutable because of this. Another engineering team could have completely different assumptions, and you may wind up with some unexpected vulnerabilities there. Lastly, disabling guest access in identity pools. So let's say you have an identity pool and it doesn't need, or it doesn't have a good business use case for users to interact with it without authentication, without unauthenticated. Make sure you disable that. If there's no good reason to have these features in, just try to disable them. And then as well, defining least privilege IAM policies everywhere. This is, I think, applicable to almost anything in AWS. A lot of times, engineers will sort of make it work first and then do security. But then if it gets released to production in between that, you find yourself in a lot of situations where the IAM policies are not least privilege and often end up opening the risk of vulnerability and an exploit there. And then finally, limiting exposure of the configuration IDs. So this is information that may not necessarily need to be in the front end assets or exposed to users. So you could put it in the back end and sort of hide it a little bit. But again, it's not a huge thing, just something to consider. Okay. Resources. So I didn't invent this. I didn't invent a lot of the information here. This is sort of an aggregation of information that I found useful when sort of learning about this service a few years ago, and things that have helped me create documentation or help others exploit it myself. And yeah, on the top here is the associated blog post with the lab that I was referring to at the beginning. I don't know how to pronounce that. Doyensec? Doyensec? All right. Well, I didn't do too bad my first time. There we go. So yeah, Doyensec has a cool Cognito lab that will sort of walk you through how to actually exploit some of the those instances where user attributes are mutable when they should be immutable. This third paper I really like because it's sort of like a, yeah, as it says, a super large scale analysis of some of those unauthenticated identity pools, and it shows some really, really interesting impact there. It's kind of old now, yeah, 2019. But yeah, I won't go through all of them. Definitely always refer to the docs. Super useful, as I said before, things change. The naming conventions have changed as well in the past 2 years. So always refer to those docs. And that's it. And hopefully that's helpful. I'm not really big on social media, so I just have LinkedIn. You can message me, and I will do my best to get back to you. But yeah, that's it.
Do you have any questions?
Yeah, does anybody have any general questions?
Discord didn't have it.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Yep, yep.